The waitress was fired for theft, and the millionaire saw her ring. The same one he gave his daughter before she disappeared 20 years ago. Lauren adjusted her apron, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn fabric as she prepared for another busy night at Angelo's, a small family-owned restaurant on the outskirts of Chicago. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the chatter of regulars who occupied their usual spots at the counter. For Lauren, this place wasn't just a job. It was her lifeline. From a young age, life had demanded resilience from her. Growing up in an orphanage in Dallas, she had learned to fend for herself. She carried those lessons into adulthood, becoming the kind of person who always put others first. Her coworkers often teased her about her relentless optimism, but it was her way of surviving. If she didn't believe things could get better, what else was there to hold on to? Tonight, however, felt different. The restaurant buzzed with an unusual energy as the staff prepared for a private gala. White linens covered the tables, and the soft glow of fairy lights transformed the modest space into something almost magical. Lauren glanced at the guest list taped to the wall in the kitchen. Names she didn't recognize but knew belonged to the kind of people who lived far from her world of double shifts and unpaid bills. "Lauren, can you grab the champagne from the back?" Maria, the manager, called out, her voice sharp with stress. "On it," Lauren replied, wiping her hands on her apron before hurrying to the storage room. The evening unfolded like clockwork, each course served with precision. Lauren weaved through the room with practiced ease, her tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. She overheard snippets of conversation, discussions about business deals, lavish vacations, and expensive gifts. It was a glimpse into a life she couldn't imagine, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to belong to this world. But reality had a way of pulling her back. As she approached a table near the center of the room, a woman's sharp voice cut through the hum of conversation. "Excuse me, stop right there." Lauren froze. The woman, dressed in a gown that probably cost more than Lauren earned in a month, pointed a manicured finger directly at her. "My necklace," the woman said, her tone icy. "It's gone, and I saw her near our table just minutes ago." A murmur spread through the crowd as all eyes turned to Lauren. Her heart pounded in her chest, heat rushing to her face. I didn't take anything," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs. Maria rushed to the scene, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" The woman crossed her arms. "Check her pockets. I wouldn't be surprised if you find it." "Wait a second," Lauren protested, stepping back. "I didn't do anything wrong." Maria hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Lauren, maybe it's better if you leave for the night." "What?" Lauren's voice cracked. "You can't be serious. Just go," Maria said softly, avoiding Lauren's gaze. The humiliation was suffocating with trembling hands. Lauren untied her apron and set it on the counter. She grabbed her bag from the staff room, her fingers brushing against the small velvet pouch inside. The weight of the anal was oddly comforting, though it did little to ease the ache in her chest as she stepped outside into the cool Chicago air. The laughter and music from the restaurant faded behind her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand justice, but what good would it do? Lauren adjusted her bag on her shoulder and began walking down the dimly lit street. Her mind swirled with thoughts of rent due in a week, groceries she couldn't afford, and the cruel reality of starting over yet again. She didn't notice the man standing a few feet away until she nearly collided with him. "Excuse me," she muttered, stepping aside, but the man didn't move. "Miss," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lauren looked up, her eyes meeting his. He was tall. With salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet authority, she recognized him as one of the guests from the restaurant. "I think you dropped this," he said, holding out a small gold ring with a ruby glinting in the streetlight. Her breath caught. The ring must have slipped out of her bag in her haste to leave. She reached for it, but the man's hand lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone now laced with curiosity. Lauren hesitated. It's all I have left of my mother," she said softly. "I don't know where it's from. It's just always been with me." The man's expression shifted, a mixture of shock and something deeper, hope. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lauren," she replied, confused. The man took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. And where are you from, Lauren? Dallas, she said, her brow furrowing. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the ring again, his hand trembling slightly. Because, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, this ring belonged to my daughter. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the entire city had gone silent around them. Lauren stared at the man, her confusion deepening with every second of his silence. Your daughter, she echoed, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. The man nodded, his gaze still fixed on the ring. Yes, Emily, my daughter disappeared years ago. This ring. He paused, taking a deep breath as his voice threatened to crack. It was hers. I gave it to her on her 10th birthday. Lauren shook her head slowly. There's no way. This ring has been with me as long as I can remember. I grew up with it in the orphanage. It can't be the same one. The man's eyes softened, though they still held a mixture of disbelief and something else. Desperation. Please, just tell me more. I need to understand. Lauren glanced down the empty street, weighing her options. She had just lost her job, her reputation shattered in front of a room full of strangers. And now, here was this man claiming her most prized possession wasn't even hers. Still, there was something in his voice that made her pause. She sighed. Fine, but I don't have much to say. Like I told you, I grew up in an orphanage in Dallas. I don't know who my parents are or where this ring came from. It was just always there. The man's expression grew even more intent. Dallas, he repeated softly, almost to himself. That's where it all started. Look, I don't know what you're hoping to find, but I'm not your daughter, Lauren said firmly, taking a step back. Wait, he said, his tone calming. I'm sorry if I'm coming on too strong. My name is Richard Adams. He extended a hand, but Lauren hesitated. I'm not trying to upset you, it's just, this ring, it's impossible for it to be here unless, he trailed off. Shaking his head, Lauren folded her arms, unsure of what to say. Please, he said again, his voice almost pleading. At least let me help you. I can't ignore this, if there's even the slightest chance that... I don't need your help, Lauren interrupted, though her voice lacked conviction. She hated the vulnerability creeping into her tone. Richard studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. You're struggling. I can see it. If nothing else, let me give you a ride home. It's late, and the city isn't always safe. Lauren hesitated. She had no reason to trust him, but there was a sincerity in his voice that made her pause, against her better judgment. She nodded. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. Lauren kept her eyes on the passing city lights, wondering if she had made a mistake. Richard, meanwhile, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. Finally, he spoke. You said you grew up in an orphanage. Do you remember how you got there? Lauren shook her head. No. They told me I was left there as a baby. No name, no note. Just me and the ring. Richard glanced at her, his brow furrowed. Did anyone ever try to find out who your parents were? They tried, but nothing ever came of it. I guess no one was looking for me. She gave a bitter laugh. Guess I wasn't worth finding. Richard's hands tightened on the wheel. Don't say that, he said quietly. Lauren didn't respond. When they reached her small apartment building, Lauren hesitated before stepping out of the car. Thanks for the ride, she said, her voice softer than before. Lauren, Richard said, stopping her before she closed the door. I know this might sound crazy, but would you let me help you look into your past? Just to see if there's a connection? If I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone. But if there's even a chance... She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of deception. But all she saw was genuine hope, and maybe a little fear. I don't know, she said finally. I don't even know you. Richard nodded, as if expecting her response. I understand here. He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. If you change your mind, call me anytime. Lauren took the card reluctantly. Good night, Mr. Adams. Good night. Lauren? Inside her apartment. Lauren sank onto the couch, the day's events crashing over her like a wave. She pulled the ring from her pocket and held it up, letting the light catch the ruby. Was it possible? Could this man really be connected to her past? She shook her head. No, she whispered to herself. It's just a coincidence. But deep down, A seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, back in his car, Richard sat in silence, the business card he had given Lauren weighing heavily on his mind. "It has to be her," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It has to be." The next morning, sunlight filtered through Lauren's small apartment window, illuminating the cluttered yet cozy space she called home. She sat cross-legged on her couch, the small velvet pouch containing the ring resting on the coffee table in front of her. She hadn't slept much. Her mind replayed the events of the previous night, the accusation, the humiliation, and most of all, the strange encounter with Richard Adams. Her fingers toyed with the business card he had given her. The name printed in bold letters looked foreign in her hands. Richard Adams. She had Googled him out of curiosity after coming home. The man wasn't just wealthy. He was a magnate, known for his sprawling business empire and quiet philanthropy. What could someone like him possibly want with her? She leaned back with a sigh. "It's probably nothing," she muttered, though she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Maria, the restaurant manager. For a split second, hope flickered in Lauren's chest. Maybe Maria was calling to apologize or offer her job back. But when she answered, her hopes were quickly dashed. "Lauren, I'm sorry about what happened last night," Maria began, her tone hesitant. "But I can't have you coming back, the guests. They expect a certain level of professionalism, and this whole thing just wasn't my fault," Lauren cut in, her voice firm. "I know," Maria said quietly, "but perception is everything. I'll mail you your final paycheck." Lauren ended the call without another word, her chest tightening. She threw her phone onto the couch, fighting the sting of tears. Across the city, Richard Adams sat in his expansive home office, a cup of coffee growing cold on his desk. He had spent the night poring over old photographs and news clippings, anything that might offer a connection between Lauren and the daughter he had lost 2 decades ago. On his desk lay the last photo ever taken of Emily, her bright smile framed by curls, and the unmistakable glint of the ruby ring on her finger. Richard traced the edge of the photo, his mind racing. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Detective Harris." A gruff voice answered on the other end. "Harris, it's Richard. I need you to find someone for me," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Later that afternoon, Lauren found herself walking aimlessly through the streets of Chicago, the business card still tucked into her jacket pocket. She wasn't sure where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't sit in her apartment any longer. Her feet eventually led her to a small park. She sat on a bench, watching families play in the autumn breeze. The sight tugged at something deep inside her, something she couldn't quite name before she could dwell on it. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Lauren, it's Richard," came the familiar voice. Her grip tightened on the phone. "How did you get my number?" "You gave it to the restaurant when you started working there," he said simply. "I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. I meant what I said. I want to help you." Lauren hesitated. "Why? You don't even know me." There was a pause on the other end. "Because I think I do." That evening, Lauren reluctantly agreed to meet Richard at a quiet cafe downtown. She told herself it was only to get him off her back, but deep down, she was curious. When she arrived, Richard was already there, a cup of tea untouched in front of him. He stood as she approached, offering her a warm smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Lauren crossed her arms. "I'm still not sure why I did." Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. "I know this might seem strange, but I have a feeling there's more to your story than you realize, and I want to help you figure it out." She studied him for a moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, she reached into her bag and placed the ring on the table between them. "This is all I have," she said quietly. Richard picked up the ring, his hand trembling slightly. "This ring," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "is identical to the one I gave my daughter Emily before she disappeared." Lauren's chest tightened. "But that doesn't mean—" "Please," Richard interrupted gently. "Let me tell you my story. And then, if you want, you can walk away and I won't bother you again." Lauren hesitated but nodded. Richard told her everything, about Emily. his bright and adventurous daughter who had vanished 20 years ago, about the exhaustive search that led nowhere, about the guilt that had haunted him every day since. By the time he finished, Lauren's coffee had gone cold. She stared at the ring in his hand, her thoughts a whirlwind. "I don't see how this proves anything," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know it doesn't," Richard admitted. "That's why I hired a detective to look into your past." Lauren's eyes widened. "You what?" "I'm sorry," he said quickly, "but I had to. If there's even a chance that you're Emily, I need to know." Lauren stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You had no right—" "I know," Richard said, standing as well. "But please, just give it a chance. If I'm wrong, you'll never hear from me again. But if I'm right—" Lauren stared at him, torn between anger and a strange flicker of hope. Finally, she grabbed her bag and turned to leave. "Lauren," Richard called after her, "you deserve to know the truth, whatever it is." She paused at the door but didn't look back. The door of the cafe slammed shut behind Lauren as she stepped into the crisp evening air. Her mind raced, her emotions a storm of anger, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. How had her life turned upside down in less than 24 hours? She walked without direction, her thoughts replaying Richard's words. You deserve to know the truth. The truth. She had spent her entire life without answers, without a family. Did she even want the truth? Or was she better off leaving the past buried? Inside the cafe, Richard remained seated, staring at the empty chair Lauren had vacated. The ring sat in front of him, glinting under the soft overhead lights. I pushed her too hard, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. He paid the bill and left, sliding the ring carefully into his pocket as he drove through the city. His thoughts drifted to Emily, her laughter, the way her small hand had felt in his. The years had not dulled the ache of her absence. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. "Harris," he answered curtly. "I've got the initial report," the detective said. "It's not much, but it's a start. Want me to send it over?" "No," Richard replied. "I'll meet you at the office." The detective's office was tucked away in a nondescript building downtown. Richard parked and entered, greeted by the faint smell of stale coffee and old paper. Harris, a grizzled man in his late 50s, sat behind a cluttered desk, a file folder in his hand. "Evening, Adams," Harris said, gesturing for Richard to sit. "I ran some preliminary checks on the girl, Lauren, Collins, right?" Richard nodded. "She was left at an orphanage in Dallas as a baby. No name, no note, no record of who brought her there. She's clean. No criminal record, no major red flags." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Richard. But here's the kicker. He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a worn document, yellowed with age. A record from the orphanage detailing the belongings Lauren had when she was found. A single item was listed. Gold ring with ruby. Richard's heart skipped a beat. "It's the same ring," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris nodded. "Looks that way, but it's not enough to prove anything. If you want answers, you'll need more. DNA, witnesses, something concrete." Richard leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Do whatever it takes," he said. Lauren returned to her apartment late that night. Exhausted from walking aimlessly for hours, she tossed her bag onto the couch and sank into bed without changing. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragments of memories she couldn't quite piece together. The next morning, she was jolted awake by a knock at her door. Still groggy, she stumbled to answer it. Richard stood in the hallway, holding a bag of coffee and pastries. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "I owe you an apology," he said, his tone sincere. "And breakfast." Lauren hesitated, but eventually stepped aside to let him in. Over steaming cups of coffee, Richard explained what he had learned from Harris. "Lauren, I know this might be hard to hear," he began carefully, "but there's a chance, just a chance, that you're my daughter." She stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. "But how could that even be possible?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But the ring, the timing, it's too much to ignore. I had a detective look into your past, and the records match." Lauren shook her head. "This is insane." "I know," he said gently, "and I'm not asking you to believe me. I just want you to let me help you find out the truth." She set her coffee down, her hands trembling. "And if I'm not who you think I am, then I'll let you go," Richard promised. "No more calls, no more showing up unannounced. But if there's even a small chance that you're Emily—" He hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't let it go, Lauren. I need to know." After a long silence, Lauren finally spoke. "What would you need to prove it?" "A DNA test," Richard said simply. Lauren swallowed hard. The idea made her stomach churn, but part of her, a small, fragile part, wanted answers. "Okay," she said quietly, "but only if it's done on my terms." "Of course," Richard agreed. Later that day, they visited a private clinic where a sample was taken from each of them. The process was quick, but the weight of it lingered long after they left. As they walked back to Richard's car, Lauren broke the silence. "What if I'm not her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then you're still someone worth helping," Richard replied without hesitation. Lauren stopped walking, staring at him, staring. "Why do you care so much? You don't even know me." Richard met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I've spent 20 years waiting for an answer, and even if you're not Emily, you deserve to know where you came from." Lauren didn't reply, but something in his words resonated with her that evening. Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the photograph of Emily on his desk. The waiting would be unbearable, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Lauren, meanwhile, lay awake in her tiny apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She didn't know what the test results would reveal, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same. The days that followed dragged on like molasses, each one heavier than the last. For Lauren, the waiting felt unbearable. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart jumped, only to deflate when it wasn't the call she was dreading or hoping for. At work, she had always found solace in the chaos of the restaurant. But now that her job was gone, the silence of her apartment was oppressive. She spent hours pacing the small space, her mind racing with questions. What if it's true? What if it's not? What happens next either way? Richard wasn't faring much better. In his office, he buried himself in work during the day, but at night, the emptiness of his mansion seemed to amplify the silence. The photograph of Emily on his desk was a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he might have found. One morning, Lauren's phone buzzed, breaking her out of a restless sleep. Her heart pounded as she saw the name on the screen, Richard Adams. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? Lauren?" Richard's voice was calm but held a sense of urgency. "The results are in. Can we meet to discuss them?" Her stomach churned. She wasn't sure she was ready for whatever truth the test would reveal, but she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. "Okay," she said quietly. "Where?" An hour later, they sat across from each other in a private room at a cafe Richard frequented. The envelope lay unopened on the table between them. "Do you want me to open it?" Richard asked gently. Lauren nodded, unable to speak. With careful hands, Richard broke the seal and pulled out the folded papers. His eyes scanned the page, his breath catching. "It's a match," he said softly, his voice trembling. "You're my daughter." Lauren stared at him, the words taking a moment to sink in. I don't understand. How is this even possible?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, his eyes glassy. "But it means you're Emily, my Emily." Lauren leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. She had spent her whole life wondering who she was. And now, in an instant, the answer felt overwhelming. "What happens now?" she whispered. Richard reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. "Now, we figure this out together." The following days were a whirlwind. Richard hired a private investigator, determined to piece together what had happened all those years ago. Lauren reluctantly agreed to stay in his guest house. Though the sudden shift to a life of luxury was jarring, Richard tried to give her space. But his excitement was hard to contain. He showed her old photo albums, recounting stories of Emily's childhood. Lauren listened quietly, torn between curiosity and discomfort. One photo caught her attention, a picture of Emily on her 10th birthday, holding the ruby ring. "I still remember that day," Richard said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She begged me to let her wear the ring. I told her it was too special, but she insisted." Lauren traced the edges of the photograph. And then she disappeared. Richard nodded, his expression darkening. One moment, she was playing in the yard. The next, she was gone. Meanwhile, the private investigator, Harris, was making progress. He pieced together records from the orphanage in Dallas and traced the few leads he could find. One detail stood out. A witness had seen a man drop off a baby at the orphanage the night Lauren was found. The description of the man was vague, but Harris was determined to dig deeper. He uncovered employment records from around the same time and found a potential lead, a man named Peter Grayson, a former employee of Richard's company who had been fired shortly before Emily's disappearance. Harris brought the information to Richard. "Peter Grayson," Harris said, sliding a file across the desk. "He had access to your home at the time, and he left the company under less than amicable circumstances." Richard's jaw tightened as he scanned the file. "Do you think he could have—" "It's possible," Harris said. "I've already started looking for him, but he's been off the radar for years." Lauren, unaware of Harris's findings, tried to adjust to her new reality. She found herself drawn to Richard's stories, though she struggled to reconcile the idea of being Emily with the life she had known. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Richard handed her a small box. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I saved for Emily," he said. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, engraved with the words, "Forever, my little girl." Lauren's throat tightened as she held the bracelet. "I don't know if I can be her," she said quietly. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself," Richard replied. "You're Lauren. You're my daughter. That's all that matters." Harris called late that night. "We found him," he told Richard. "Peter Grayson. He's living in a small town in Texas. If he knows anything, he's the key to what happened." Richard's heart raced. "I'll be on the next flight." "What about Lauren?" Harris asked. Richard hesitated. "She deserves to know, but I don't want to overwhelm her. I'll tell her when I'm back." The next morning, Richard told Lauren he had a business trip and would be gone for a few days. She nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from her, as Richard boarded the plane to Texas. Lauren sat in the guest house staring at the bracelet. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life could be like if she truly belonged. Richard's flight landed in the small, dusty Texas town, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The golden light cast long shadows over the buildings, giving everything an air of faded grandeur. As he stepped off the plane, his determination hardened. This trip could finally uncover the truth that had eluded him for so many years. Harris met him outside the tiny airport in a weathered sedan, its engine idling softly. "He's living in a small house on the edge of town," Harris said, as Richard climbed into the passenger seat. "I've been watching him for a few days. Seems like he's keeping a low profile." "What kind of man is he?" Richard asked, his jaw tightening. Harris sighed. "Quiet, keeps to himself, but people around here say he's not someone to cross. Got a temper." Richard nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. If Peter Grayson was responsible for taking Emily, what had driven him to such a heinous act? And why had he abandoned her at an orphanage instead of demanding a ransom or using her as leverage? The house came into view, a rundown structure at the end of a dirt road. The yard was overgrown, with rusted tools and broken furniture scattered across it. Harris parked a safe distance away. "You want me to come with you?" Harris asked, his tone cautious. "No," Richard said firmly. "This is something I need to do alone." He stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he approached the front door. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum. He knocked twice, after a long pause. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with graying hair and sunken eyes. He wore a threadbare shirt and jeans, and his expression was guarded. "Peter Grayson?" Richard asked, his voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Richard Adams," he said. "I think you know why I'm here." Grayson's expression hardened, but he didn't deny it. "I don't know anything," he said, starting to close the door. Richard stuck his foot in the gap. "You owe me the truth. It's been 20 years. I deserve to know what happened to my daughter." The mention of Emily seemed to strike a nerve. Grayson hesitated, his grip on the door tightening. "You don't want to open this door, Adams," he muttered. "Too late for that," Richard replied. Grayson sighed and stepped back, letting the door swing open. Fine, come in. Inside, the house was as unkempt as the yard. Empty beer cans and cigarette butts littered the table, and the air was thick with the smell of stale smoke. Grayson motioned for Richard to sit, but he remained standing, his eyes fixed on the man who might hold the key to his past. "I've been running from this for years," Grayson began, collapsing into a worn armchair. "But I guess it was only a matter of time before you came knocking." "Why did you take her?" Richard demanded, his voice rising. Grayson rubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders sagging. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was desperate, okay? You fired me without a second thought. Left me with nothing, I thought. If I took her, you'd pay up." Richard's stomach turned. "You kidnapped a child for money." "I didn't mean to hurt her," Grayson said quickly. "But then things spiraled out of control. I got scared. Too many people were asking questions, so I had to let her go." "Let her go," Richard repeated, his voice trembling with anger. "I left her at an orphanage," Grayson admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "In Dallas, figured someone would take care of her." Richard clenched his fists, the weight of Grayson's words sinking in. For 20 years, his daughter had been out there, abandoned and alone, all because of this man's greed. "You destroyed my family," Richard said through gritted teeth. Grayson looked up, his face etched with guilt. "I know, and I've lived with that every day since, back in New York." Lauren tried to settle into her new routine, but something felt off. Richard's sudden business trip didn't sit right with her, and the emptiness of the guest house only amplified her unease. She spent most of her time in the library, poring over old photo albums and scrapbooks Richard had left for her. Each image of Emily felt like a ghost, haunting her with questions she couldn't answer. As she flipped through a scrapbook, a newspaper clipping caught her eye. The headline read, "Daughter of Business Tycoon Disappears Without a Trace." Lauren's hands trembled as she read the article, her mind racing. She had always wondered about her past, but now, faced with the possibility of being Emily, the weight of it all was almost too much to bear. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Harris. "Lauren, it's Detective Harris," he said. "Richard asked me to keep an eye on things while he's out of town. Just checking in. Do you know where he is?" Lauren asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. There was a pause on the other end. "He didn't tell you?" "No," she said, her brow furrowing. "Well," Harris began hesitantly, "he's looking for answers about what happened to Emily. He's in Texas, meeting someone who might know the truth." Lauren's heart sank. He's still keeping secrets, she thought, as Richard left Grayson's house that evening. His mind was heavy with the revelations. He had answers, but they only seemed to raise more questions. Why had Grayson targeted Emily in the first place? And why hadn't he tried to reach out sooner? But as he started the car, one thing was clear. He needed to tell Lauren everything. Richard returned to New York late at night, the city's lights glimmering in the distance as the car sped toward his estate. Exhaustion weighed on him, but the urgency to speak with Lauren kept him alert. The revelations from Peter Grayson replayed in his mind like a broken record. He had finally uncovered the truth, but delivering it to Lauren felt like an impossible task. At the guest house, Lauren was wide awake, sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around her knees. She had tried to distract herself with books and TV, but her thoughts kept returning to Richard's abrupt departure. When she heard his car pull into the driveway, she sprang to her feet, a mixture of frustration and relief bubbling to the surface. The door opened, and Richard stepped inside, his face etched with fatigue. Before he could speak, Lauren crossed her arms and fixed him with a pointed look. "Texas," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Richard froze, surprised by her tone. "You spoke to Harris," he said, more a statement than a question. "I did," Lauren replied. "Why didn't you tell me where you were going? You said you wanted us to figure this out together, but you left me in the dark." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't trying to shut you out. I just didn't want to overwhelm you. I needed to confirm some things first." "And," Lauren pressed, her heart pounding. Richard gestured to the couch. "We need to talk." Lauren sat stiffly, her hands gripping the edge of the cushion as Richard recounted his meeting with Peter Grayson. He explained everything: the man's grudge, the kidnapping, and Emily's abandonment at the orphanage. By the time he finished, Lauren's face was pale. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "So, that's it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was stolen and dumped like I didn't matter." "You mattered," Richard said urgently. "You always mattered. This wasn't your fault, Lauren." Grayson acted out of anger and desperation. "But none of that changes who you are, or how much you were loved." Lauren stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Loved by who? I grew up in an orphanage." "Richard, no one came for me. No one even looked for me." Richard rose, his voice trembling. "I looked for you. For years. I did everything I could to find you. I thought I failed you. But now I know Grayson covered his tracks too well. If I had known..." "You didn't." Lauren cut him off, tears brimming in her eyes. "You didn't know, and neither did I. So what are we supposed to do with this now?" Richard stepped closer, his voice gentle. "We move forward, together. I can't change what happened, but I can promise you this. You'll never be alone again." Lauren blinked back her tears, her emotions warring inside her. Part of her wanted to trust him, to believe in the family she never thought she'd have. But another part, the one shaped by years of abandonment, screamed for her to keep her guard up. The next morning, Lauren sat by the window, watching the autumn leaves drift to the ground. Richard had given her space. Retreating to his office to let her process everything, she glanced at the bracelet he had given her, now resting on the table. The inscription, "Forever my little girl," stung in a way she couldn't quite explain. Her phone buzzed, and she saw Harris's name on the screen. She hesitated before answering. "Lauren," Harris said, his voice serious, "I know this is a lot to take in, but there's something else you need to know." "What is it?" she asked warily. "I dug a little deeper into Grayson's story," Harris continued, "and I found some discrepancies. It looks like he wasn't working alone." Lauren's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "There's evidence to suggest someone else orchestrated the kidnapping. Someone close to Richard." Lauren's heart sank. "Do you know who?" "I have a strong lead," Harris said, "but I need more time to confirm it. I thought you should know." That evening, Lauren confronted Richard. "Harris called," she said, her tone guarded. "He thinks there's more to this story." Richard's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "He thinks Grayson wasn't working alone," Lauren said, watching his reaction carefully. "That someone close to you might have been involved." Richard's face darkened, his mind racing. "Close to me? That's impossible." "Is it?" Lauren challenged. Richard hesitated, his thoughts turning to the people who had been in his life at the time of Emily's disappearance. One name lingered in his mind, unbidden but insistent. Margaret, meanwhile. Margaret Adams sat in her lavish penthouse, sipping a glass of wine as she scrolled through her phone. She had seen the news. Richard's long-lost daughter had been found. A cold smile tugged at her lips. So, the little girl survived after all, she thought. She had spent years ensuring her secret remained buried. But now, with Lauren back in Richard's life, everything was at risk. She reached for her phone and dialed a number. "We have a problem," she said curtly. "I need you to handle it." Richard's sleepless night was filled with memories he couldn't suppress. Margaret had been distraught when Emily disappeared, or so he'd thought. But as the pieces began to align, doubt crept in. By morning, he was resolved. Harris needs to investigate Margaret, he told himself. If she had anything to do with this, I need to know. Downstairs, Lauren sat with a cup of coffee, her mind just as restless. She didn't trust Margaret, though she couldn't pinpoint why, but one thing was clear. The truth, whatever it was, wasn't finished revealing itself. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard and Lauren sat in the study, their conversations growing shorter with every passing hour. Both were weighed down by the implications of what Harris had uncovered, that someone close to Richard might have orchestrated the events that led to Emily's disappearance. For Richard, the possibility was unbearable. The thought that someone he trusted could have betrayed him so deeply gnawed at his resolve. For Lauren, it was another layer of uncertainty in a life already riddled with unanswered questions. The silence was broken when Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately. "Harris," he said, his tone tense. "What have you found?" There was a pause on the other end before Harris's voice came through. "It's not confirmed yet, but all signs point to Margaret. She had the motive, the access and connections to Peter Grayson at the time. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Margaret, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without direct evidence," Harris replied. "There's a paper trail linking her to some of Grayson's financial dealings. It's circumstantial, but it's there." Richard's jaw clenched. "Keep digging, I need the truth." Richard hung up and turned to Lauren, who had been watching him closely. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "He thinks Margaret was involved," Richard admitted, his voice low. "But we need proof." Lauren leaned back, her arms crossed. "She always did seem off," she said, her brow furrowed. Richard nodded. "She was devastated when Emily disappeared, or so I thought. But now, I'm starting to wonder if it was all an act." "What are you going to do?" Lauren asked. Richard's gaze hardened. "I'm going to confront her." That evening, Richard drove to Margaret's penthouse. The city lights glimmered in the distance as he stepped out of the car. His heart pounding, he had rehearsed what he would say, but as he entered the building, doubts crept in. When Margaret opened the door, she greeted him with a saccharine smile. "Richard, what a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We need to talk," Richard said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Margaret closed the door, her expression shifting. "This sounds serious. What's going on?" Richard turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "It's about Lauren." Margaret's smile faltered. "Lauren?" she repeated, feigning confusion. "You mean Emily?" "Yes, Emily," Richard said sharply. "Or did you forget her name after all these years?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that you had something to do with her disappearance," Richard said, his voice rising. "Harris found records linking you to Peter Grayson. Tell me the truth, Margaret. Were you behind this?" Margaret's expression hardened, but she didn't flinch. "That's ridiculous," she said coolly. "I was just as devastated as you were when Emily disappeared. How dare you accuse me of something so vile?" "Don't lie to me," Richard snapped. "I trusted you, Margaret. I believed you when you cried, when you swore you'd do anything to find her. But now, I see it for what it was. An act." Margaret's facade cracked, and for a moment, anger flickered in her eyes. "And what if it was?" she said, her voice icy. Richard's heart sank. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "Because you were going to leave everything to her. Emily was your perfect little girl. And Ethan and I were just afterthoughts. Do you know what that does to a person? To a mother?" Richard stared at her, his disbelief giving way to fury. "She was a child, Margaret, our child. How could you do this?" "I didn't plan for it to go that far," Margaret said, her tone defensive. "I just wanted her out of the picture for a while. But Grayson took things too far. And you let it happen," Richard said, his voice trembling with rage. Margaret's gaze faltered. "I thought he'd bring her back. I thought—" She trailed off, her voice cracking. Richard took a step closer, his voice deadly calm. "You destroyed our family for money. For power. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Margaret didn't answer, her silence confirming everything. Back at the estate, Lauren paced the living room, her anxiety mounting as the hours ticked by. When Richard finally returned, his face was pale, his shoulders slumped. "What happened?" Lauren asked. Rushing to his side, Richard sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. "It was her," he said quietly. "Margaret was behind it all." Lauren froze, her mind struggling to process the revelation. "Why?" she whispered. "Because of the inheritance," Richard said bitterly. "She wanted Ethan to have everything. She thought if Emily was gone, I'd have no choice." Lauren's stomach churned. "So, I was just collateral damage." "No," Richard said firmly, meeting her gaze. "You are so much more than that. Margaret may have tried to take everything from us, but she didn't succeed. We found each other again. Lauren, and I won't let her take you away from me a second time." Lauren nodded slowly, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and relief. "What happens now?" she asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "Now, Margaret faces the consequences." That night, as the city slept, Richard called Harris with the full story. He would ensure that Margaret's actions were exposed, and justice would finally be served. But as he hung up the phone, a thought lingered in his mind. This was far from over. Margaret wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and he knew she would strike back. The following morning dawned gray and overcast. As though the world itself mirrored the storm brewing in Richard's life, he sat in his study, staring at his phone, waiting for Harris to call with the next steps. Every second felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, in the guest house, Lauren stood by the window, watching the leaves scatter across the lawn. Her mind churned with everything Richard had told her the night before. Margaret's betrayal felt like a wound that wasn't hers, yet it cut deeply. The idea that her life, her entire identity, had been stolen as part of a cruel scheme was almost too much to bear. The sharp knock at her door startled her out of her thoughts. She opened it to find Richard standing there, his expression somber but resolute. "Can we talk?" he asked. Lauren nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Lauren spoke. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've told Harris everything. He's working on building a case against Margaret. It's going to take time, but we'll get justice." Lauren studied him, her emotions warring. "Justice for who? For me? For Emily? Or for you?" Richard looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "For all of us," he said firmly. "What she did was unforgivable, but that doesn't define who we are. We have a chance to rebuild, Lauren, to be a family again." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "You keep saying that, but I don't even know what family is supposed to feel like." Richard's face softened. "I know this is overwhelming. I'm not asking you to accept everything all at once, but I want to be here for you, however long it takes." Lauren looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "It's just hard to believe any of this is real." "It's real," Richard said, his voice gentle, "and I'm not going anywhere." Across the city, Margaret sat in her penthouse, her mind racing. The confrontation with Richard the night before had left her shaken, but not defeated. She had spent years covering her tracks, and she wasn't about to let everything unravel now. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "I need you to take care of something," she said curtly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. On the other end of the line, a man's voice replied, "Consider it done." Margaret hung up, her grip tightening on the phone. If Richard thought he could outmaneuver her, he was sorely mistaken. That evening, Richard and Lauren sat together in the main house, sorting through old photo albums. Richard had insisted on showing her every memory he had preserved of Emily, hoping it would help her connect with the life she had lost. Lauren picked up a picture of Emily at a birthday party, her smile bright as she held a slice of cake. "She looks happy," Lauren said softly. "She was," Richard replied, his voice tinged with sadness. "You were always full of life, always curious about everything. You'd ask 100 questions a day just to hear the answers." Lauren smiled faintly. "I still do that," Richard chuckled. "Some things don't change." For the first time since meeting him, Lauren felt a flicker of connection, a small thread tying her to the person she might have been. Later that night, as Lauren prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "You don't belong there. Leave before it's too late." Her stomach dropped. She stared at the message, her heart pounding. Who would send something like that? Was it Margaret, or someone else trying to warn her? Lauren debated telling Richard, but something held her back. Instead, she locked the door and tried to convince herself it was nothing. The next morning, Harris arrived at the estate with updates. Richard greeted him in the study, eager for news. "We've got enough to move forward," Harris said. "The financial trail linking Margaret to Grayson is solid. It's not direct evidence of the kidnapping, but it's enough to build a case." "And Margaret?" Richard asked. "She's already making moves," Harris replied. "I've got people watching her, but she's slippery. I wouldn't be surprised if she tries to undermine you before we can take her down." Richard nodded, his expression grim. "Let her try. I'm ready for whatever she throws at me." Meanwhile, Lauren decided to take a walk around the property, hoping to clear her mind. The estate's sprawling grounds were peaceful, the autumn air crisp and invigorating. As she wandered near the edge of the property, a man stepped out from behind a tree. He was tall and dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hat. "Lauren Collins?" he asked, his voice low. Lauren froze, her instincts screaming at her to run. "Who's asking?" she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. The man smirked. "Just delivering a message." He tossed an envelope at her feet and disappeared into the woods before she could respond. Lauren stared at the envelope, her hands trembling as she picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. "This isn't your fight. Leave while you still can." Lauren returned to the house, her heart racing. She found Richard in the study with Harris and held out the note. "This was left for me," she said, her voice shaking. Richard's face darkened as he read it. "Margaret," he said through gritted teeth. Harris nodded. "She's trying to scare her off. It's a desperate move." "Well, it's not going to work," Lauren said, her voice firm. Richard looked at her, surprised by her determination. "You're sure?" Lauren met his gaze. "I'm not running, Richard. Not this time." The tension in the estate reached a boiling point after Lauren's encounter near the woods. Richard insisted on increasing security, but Lauren's resolve only grew stronger. She refused to let Margaret intimidate her, though the fear lingered in the back of her mind. "She thinks she can scare me off," Lauren said to Richard that evening as they sat in the study. "But I've been through worse." "I'm not going anywhere." Richard admired her strength, though a part of him wished she didn't have to endure this fight. He knew Margaret's methods all too well. Manipulative, ruthless, and unrelenting. She wouldn't back down unless forced to. Across the city, Margaret was anything but calm. Her plan to intimidate Lauren had failed, and the walls were closing in. Harris's investigation was tightening the noose around her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Richard made his next move. In a fit of frustration, she called Ethan, her son. "Ethan," she said sharply, "we have a problem." Ethan sighed on the other end of the line. "Let me guess. Dad and the long-lost daughter." "Yes," Margaret hissed. "She's ruining everything. Do you know what happens if she stays? You lose everything, the company, the inheritance. Everything your father built will go to her." Ethan hesitated. "I don't know, Mom. This feels wrong." "Wrong?" Margaret snapped. "You think it's wrong to fight for what's rightfully yours. You deserve that legacy, Ethan. Not some girl who just showed up out of nowhere." Ethan's silence stretched on the line. "I'll think about it," he said finally before hanging up. Margaret threw the phone onto the couch, her frustration boiling over. "If he won't act, I will," she muttered. The next day, Richard received a call from Harris. "She's making moves," Harris said. "Margaret's trying to transfer assets and liquidate accounts. It's not illegal, but it's suspicious. She's planning something." Richard clenched his fist. "Keep watching her. If she makes one wrong move, I want to know." Meanwhile, Lauren decided she couldn't sit idle. She approached Richard in the study, her expression resolute. "I want to help," she said. "Help with what?" Richard asked, setting down the papers he'd been reviewing. "With Margaret," Lauren said. "This isn't just your fight. It's mine too. I'm not going to let her get away with what she did to us." Richard hesitated. "Lauren, this is dangerous. Margaret isn't just going to roll over." "I know," Lauren replied, "but I'm tired of running. I'm tired of letting people decide my life for me. This is my chance to take it back." Richard nodded slowly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "All right, we'll do this together." Harris, with Richard's approval, brought Lauren into the fold. Together, they pored over documents, emails, and financial records. Harris showed Lauren how Margaret had funneled money to Peter Grayson years ago and how she'd continued to cover her tracks even after Emily disappeared. Lauren's anger grew with every discovery. "She didn't just ruin your life," she said to Richard. "She ruined mine too. She stole everything from me." Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Not everything. We still have each other, and we're going to make sure she pays for what she did." That evening, Margaret made her next move. She leaked a story to the press, painting Lauren as a manipulative fraud who was trying to scam her way into the Addams family fortune. The headlines were brutal. "Long-lost daughter or con artist. Wealthy heiress's return sparks family feud." When Lauren saw the news, her stomach churned. "She's trying to discredit me," she said, pacing the room. "Make it look like I don't belong here. She's desperate." Richard said, trying to calm her. "The truth will come out. We just have to stay focused." But Lauren couldn't shake the fear that Margaret's lies might stick. The next day, Ethan showed up unannounced at the estate. Lauren answered the door, surprised to see him. "Ethan?" she said cautiously. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone uncertain. Lauren stepped aside, letting him in. They sat in the living room, the tension between them thick. "Look," Ethan began. "I don't know what to think about all of this, my mom. She's always been manipulative, but I never thought she'd go this far." Lauren studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think she's planning something worse," Ethan admitted. "She's been talking to people, making deals, I don't know the details, but I don't think it's just about the money anymore." Lauren's chest tightened. "Do you believe her lies? About me being a fraud?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I've seen the DNA test results. You're my sister, whether I like it or not." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "And do you?" Ethan sighed. "I don't know yet, but I do know that what my mom did was wrong. If you want to stop her, I'll help." Lauren nodded slowly. "Okay, let's stop her." That night, Richard and Lauren sat with Harris, going over their next steps, with Ethan's insider knowledge. They had a clearer picture of Margaret's plans. "She's trying to shift blame," Harris said. "Make herself look like the victim while casting doubt on Lauren's identity." "Not this time," Richard said firmly. "We're going to expose her for what she is." Lauren glanced at Ethan, who had joined them at the table. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. He hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, I am." As the clock ticked toward midnight, the Addams family prepared for the fight of their lives. The morning dawned with a sharp chill in the air, as though the universe itself braced for the storm about to unfold. Lauren sat in the study with Richard, Ethan, and Harris, their plans meticulously laid out on the table in front of them. The tension was palpable, each person acutely aware of the risks involved in exposing Margaret's lies. "We have to be strategic," Harris said, his finger tapping a page of notes. "Margaret's already spinning her narrative with the press. We need to hit her where it hurts, evidence that she can't refute." "What kind of evidence?" Lauren asked. "Financial records, communications with Grayson, anything that proves she orchestrated the kidnapping," Harris replied. "Luckily, Ethan's given us a lead on her accounts." Ethan leaned forward, his expression conflicted. "She always used her personal assistant, Clara, to handle sensitive matters. If we can get Clara to talk, it could blow this wide open." Richard nodded. "Then we'll start there. I'll personally make sure she knows the stakes." Later that afternoon, Richard and Lauren visited Clara at her modest townhouse. The assistant looked visibly nervous as she opened the door, her eyes darting between them. "Mr. Addams," she stammered, "I wasn't expecting you." "We need to talk," Richard said firmly. Clara hesitated but stepped aside, letting them in. Once seated, Richard wasted no time. "Clara, I know Margaret used you to manage her finances and cover up her actions. This is your chance to come clean before it's too late." Clara's hands fidgeted in her lap. I don't know what you're talking about." Lauren leaned forward, her voice softer but no less determined. "We're not here to hurt you, Clara. We just want the truth. Margaret manipulated my life and tore apart this family. Please, help us set things right." Clara's gaze flickered to Lauren, guilt evident in her eyes. After a long pause, she sighed. "Fine, I'll tell you what I know." She retrieved a folder from a locked drawer and handed it to Richard. "These are copies of the transactions Margaret ordered me to handle. Some of them are payments to Grayson. Others are for private investigators she hired to keep tabs on you, Mr. Addams. She said it was to protect her reputation, but I always suspected there was more to it." Richard's jaw tightened as he flipped through the folder. "This is exactly what we need, thank you." Clara nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. "Just be careful. Margaret won't go down without a fight." Armed with the new evidence, Richard and Harris convened that evening to finalize their plan. "This will be enough to discredit her with the press and the board," Harris said. "But if we want legal action, we'll need to move fast." "I'll handle the press," Richard said. "Lauren, Ethan, and I will make a statement tomorrow. It's time to take control of the narrative." Lauren's stomach churned at the thought of facing the media, but she nodded. "I'm ready, Ethan." sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke. "I'll stand with you. I've let her control me for too long. It's time to take a stand." The next morning, the Adams family faced a sea of reporters outside Richard's corporate headquarters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust forward as the three of them stepped up to the podium. Richard began, his voice steady. "Thank you all for being here. Today, I want to set the record straight about recent accusations and reveal the truth about my family." He recounted Lauren's story, from her childhood in the orphanage to the DNA test confirming her identity as Emily Adams. He then addressed Margaret's role in the kidnapping, revealing the financial records and other evidence they had uncovered. Lauren spoke next, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. "For years, I didn't know where I came from or who I was. Margaret Adams took that from me, but I refused to let her continue to manipulate my life or this family. I'm here to reclaim what was stolen, and to make sure no one else suffers because of her lies." Ethan was the last to speak, his voice filled with regret. "I've stood by my mother for years, believing her version of events, but I can't stay silent anymore. What she did was wrong, and I won't be complicit in her schemes any longer." The reporters erupted with questions, but Richard held up a hand. "That's all we have to say for now, thank you." Margaret watched the press conference from her penthouse, her face a mask of fury. She hurled her wine glass across the room, the shattering sound echoing in the silence. "How dare they?" she hissed, pacing back and forth. Her phone buzzed with calls from board members, lawyers, and journalists, all demanding answers. Margaret ignored them, her mind racing for a way to regain control. "This isn't over," she muttered. Back at the estate, Richard, Lauren, and Ethan sat together in the living room, the tension finally giving way to relief. "You were incredible," Richard said to Lauren, his voice filled with pride. Lauren managed a small smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan nodded, his expression earnest. "We're in this together now." For the first time, Lauren felt a sense of belonging, a glimmer of hope that they could truly become a family. But even as they celebrated their victory, a lingering unease hung in the air. Margaret was still out there, and they all knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. The calm didn't last long. By the next morning, the media was ablaze with headlines about Margaret's alleged involvement in Emily's kidnapping. While many outlets praised Richard, Lauren, and Ethan for their bravery, others questioned their motives. Margaret had wasted no time launching her counterattack. A family divided. Are Richard Adams and his children telling the whole truth? Margaret Adams denies allegations, claims smear campaign by ex-husband. At the estate, Lauren sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the news on her phone. The articles were relentless, filled with speculation and veiled accusations. She set the phone down, her frustration bubbling over. "She's not going to stop," Lauren said, looking at Richard and Ethan. Richard nodded, his jaw tight. "I didn't expect her to. Margaret's always been skilled at spinning the narrative in her favor." Ethan leaned forward, his expression grim. "She's already reached out to some of my friends, trying to sway them to her side. She's claiming we're making all of this up to destroy her reputation. We need to stay ahead of her," Harris said, entering the room with a stack of papers. "I've dug up more evidence, emails, financial records, even a few witnesses who worked with Grayson. It's damning, but we'll need to present it carefully." Richard stood, his presence commanding. "Let's get everything to the authorities. The sooner we take legal action, the harder it'll be for Margaret to wriggle out of this." Across the city, Margaret was hard at work. She had summoned her legal team to her penthouse, determined to outmaneuver Richard at every turn. "I want you to challenge every piece of evidence they've brought forward," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "Discredit their witnesses, poke holes in their story, whatever it takes." Her lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria, nodded. "We can delay the case with procedural challenges, but public opinion is turning against you. If we don't act fast, the damage might be irreversible." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Then we change the narrative, leak something, anything, that puts the focus on Richard instead of me." Victoria hesitated. "What exactly do you want us to leak?" Margaret smirked. "Get creative." Back at the estate, Lauren found herself growing closer to Ethan. Despite their rocky start, they had begun to bond over their shared struggle against Margaret. One evening, they sat outside on the patio, the cool autumn air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. "I never thought I'd say this," Ethan said, staring into the distance. "But I'm glad you're here." Lauren looked at him, surprised. "Really?" He nodded. "I spent so many years believing Mom's version of events, blaming Dad for everything. But seeing the truth, it's like a weight I didn't know I was carrying has been lifted." Lauren smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd have a brother. It's strange, but not in a bad way." Ethan chuckled. Strange is putting it lightly. For the first time in years, Lauren felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to find her place in this family. The following day, Harris returned with an urgent update. "Margaret's team is making moves," he said, placing a folder on the table. "They've filed a countersuit, claiming defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It's a blatant attempt to shift the focus." Richard frowned. "Let her try. We have the evidence to back up our claims." "It's not just the legal battle you need to worry about," Harris warned. "They're leaking damaging stories about you, Richard. Old business disputes, rumors about your personal life. They're trying to tarnish your reputation." Richard sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Typical Margaret. She's always been good at turning the spotlight on someone else." Lauren crossed her arms. "So, what do we do? Just sit here and let her smear us?" "No," Harris said. "We keep pushing forward. The more pressure we apply, the more likely she is to slip up." That evening, Lauren sat in her room, sifting through old photos and documents. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't come to light. She picked up the photo of Emily wearing the ruby ring, her mind racing. What if there was more to Margaret's plan than just money and power? Unable to sleep, Lauren decided to visit Richard in his study. She found him at his desk, staring at a framed photo of Emily. "Can I ask you something?" Lauren said softly. Richard looked up, his expression tired but kind. "Of course. Do you think Margaret ever loved Emily?" Richard hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "I'd like to think so," he said finally. "But the choices she made, they don't come from love. They come from greed and ambition." Lauren nodded, her gaze distant. "I just can't understand how someone could do this. To a child. To their own family." Richard reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand on hers. "Some people let their worst instincts take over, but you're stronger than that, Lauren. Stronger than she'll ever be." The following morning, a new headline splashed across the news. "Former employee alleges misconduct by Richard Adams." It was a clear attack, orchestrated by Margaret to deflect attention from her own misdeeds. The accusations were vague and unsubstantiated, but the damage was done. Lauren slammed her phone onto the counter, furious. "This is insane. How is she getting away with this?" "She won't," Richard said, his voice calm but resolute. "The truth always comes out, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it." Harris arrived moments later, a grim expression on his face. "It's time to take the gloves off," he said. "Margaret's backed into a corner, but that makes her more dangerous. We need to hit her with everything we've got." Lauren nodded, determination burning in her eyes. "Let's finish this." The media frenzy around the Adams family reached a fever pitch. Margaret's smear campaign against Richard escalated, with one damaging headline after another. Despite the lack of evidence, the accusations planted seeds of doubt in the public's mind. At the estate, Lauren paced the living room, the tension radiating off her in waves. "We can't just sit here and let her drag us through the mud," she said, her voice sharp. "We have to do something." "We are doing something," Harris replied, his tone measured. "I filed the case against her. The evidence is solid, and the courts will see that. But the public isn't the court," Lauren shot back. "She's winning in the court of public opinion, and that matters too." Richard, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "Lauren's right. Margaret thrives on perception. If we want to stop her, we need to expose her lies in a way that's undeniable, even to the public." Harris nodded. "I've got one more card to play, but it's risky. We've tracked down a key witness, someone who worked closely with Grayson during the time of the kidnapping. If we can get them to testify, it could be the nail in Margaret's coffin." "Who is it?" Lauren asked, her curiosity piqued. Harris hesitated. "His name is Michael Reed. He was Grayson's right-hand man back then. He claims he has records of Margaret's involvement, but he wants something in return. What does he want? Richard asked, his tone wary. Protection, Harris said. He's worried Margaret will come after him if he talks. That evening, Harris arranged a meeting with Michael Reed in a secluded cafe on the outskirts of the city. Lauren insisted on coming along, despite Richard's protests. I have a right to hear what he has to say, Lauren argued. This is my life, too. Reluctantly, Richard agreed. When they arrived, Michael was already seated in a corner booth, his posture tense and his eyes scanning the room nervously. He was a wiry man with a weathered face, and his hands fidgeted with the coffee cup in front of him. Mr. Reed, Richard greeted him, sliding into the booth across from him. Michael nodded, his voice low. You came. This is my daughter, Lauren, Richard said, gesturing to her. Michael's gaze flicked to Lauren, and he offered a small, apologetic smile. I'm sorry for what happened to you. If I'd known things would go this far. He trailed off, shaking his head. You worked with Grayson, Lauren said, cutting to the chase. What can you tell us about Margaret? Michael glanced around, lowering his voice. Grayson didn't come up with the kidnapping on his own. Margaret hired him. She wanted Emily out of the picture, but Grayson went rogue. He thought he could make more money by keeping the girl longer, but when things got messy, he panicked and left her at that orphanage. Lauren's stomach churned. Hearing the details made the betrayal feel even more real. Do you have proof? Richard asked. Michael nodded, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. Emails, payment records, phone logs. It's all here. I've kept it as insurance, but I can't hold on to it anymore if Margaret finds out I'm talking to you. He let the implication hang in the air. You'll be protected, Harris assured him. I'll make sure of it. Back at the estate, the atmosphere was electric as they reviewed the files on the flash drive. The evidence was overwhelming. Direct payments from Margaret to Grayson, emails outlining her instructions, and even a recorded phone call where she discussed the plan in chilling detail. This is it, Harris said, his voice firm. This is what we've been waiting for. Richard exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. It's over for her. There's no way she can come back from this. Lauren stared at the screen, her hands clenched into fists. Good. She deserves everything that's coming to her. The next morning, Richard held a press conference, flanked by Lauren, Ethan, and Harris. This time, they came armed with the evidence Michael had provided. Richard addressed the reporters, his voice steady and resolute. For years, Margaret Adams has hidden behind lies and manipulation. Today, we're here to reveal the truth. He presented the evidence methodically, leaving no room for doubt. Lauren and Ethan each spoke briefly, sharing their experiences and emphasizing the importance of justice. When the conference ended, the reporters were buzzing with questions, their earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity and shock. Margaret watched the press conference from her penthouse, her expression a mask of cold fury. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. Her phone buzzed with calls from her legal team, but she ignored them, her mind racing for a way out. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, but deep down, she knew the tide had turned against her. That evening, Lauren and Richard sat together in the study, the tension between them finally easing. I still can't believe it's almost over, Lauren said. Staring at the fireplace, Richard nodded. It's been a long road, but we're finally getting justice. Lauren looked at him, her expression softening. Thank you for never giving up on me. Richard smiled. You're my daughter, Lauren. I could never give up on you. As they sat in comfortable silence, a sense of peace began to settle over the estate, a peace that had been missing for far too long. But neither of them realized that Margaret, cornered and desperate, was already planning her next move. The Adams estate was quiet that night, the calm a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past few weeks. Lauren sat by her bedroom window, staring at the moonlit grounds. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that this nightmare might truly be coming to an end. Downstairs, Richard and Harris reviewed their plans. The evidence provided by Michael Reed had been submitted to the authorities earlier that day, and an arrest warrant for Margaret was expected within 24 hours. This is it, Harris said, leaning back in his chair. By tomorrow, Margaret will have no way out. Richard nodded, though a sense of unease lingered in the back of his mind. Margaret wasn't the type to go down quietly. across the city. Margaret was anything but defeated. She paced her penthouse, her mind racing as she weighed her options. The evidence against her was damning, but Margaret had always thrived under pressure. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Victor," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Oh." The man on the other end chuckled. "Margaret, it's been a while. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need your help," she said, her tone cold and sharp. "I have one last move to make, and I need someone who knows how to handle things." There was a pause before Victor replied. "This sounds serious." "It is," Margaret said. "I'll pay whatever it takes. Just make sure the message is loud and clear." The next morning, Lauren woke to the sound of raised voices coming from downstairs. She quickly dressed and hurried to the study, where she found Richard and Harris in a heated discussion. "What's going on?" she asked, her gaze darting between them. Harris held up his phone, his expression grim. "Margaret's not backing down. She's gone public with her own version of events, claiming that we fabricated the evidence against her. She's even accusing you of being a fraud, Lauren." Lauren's stomach churned. "How is she still doing this? We have proof. Actual proof." "She's desperate," Richard said, his voice tight. "But we're not backing down. The truth is on our side." Despite their resolve, the day took a darker turn. As the family prepared for a follow-up meeting with their legal team, a delivery arrived at the estate. It was a single, unmarked envelope addressed to Lauren. She opened it cautiously, her hands trembling as she pulled out a note. "You've taken everything from me. Now it's my turn." Lauren's breath hitched as she passed the note to Richard. His face darkened as he read it, his hands curling into fists. "She's threatening you," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. Harris stepped forward, taking the note. "This escalates things. I'll notify the authorities immediately. We need to tighten security around the estate." As the hours passed, tension gripped the household. Security guards patrolled the grounds, and every door and window was locked. But even with the added precautions, a sense of unease lingered. That evening, Lauren sat in the living room with Ethan. He had been unusually quiet all day, and Lauren finally broke the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking about everything. How did it get to this point? She's our mother, Lauren. How could she do all of this?" Lauren hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we can't let her keep controlling us. We have to end this." Ethan looked at her, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "You're right. She doesn't get to win." Late that night, while the house was quiet, Margaret made her move, under the cover of darkness. She bypassed the estate's security and slipped onto the grounds. She wore dark clothing, her movements quick and deliberate. She made her way to the guest house where Lauren had been staying. Inside, Lauren stirred in her sleep, sensing something was wrong. A faint creak from the floorboards jolted her awake. She sat up, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The silence was deafening. Then, from the shadows, Margaret stepped into the dim light of the room. "Hello, Lauren," she said, her voice cold and sharp. Lauren froze, her blood running cold. "What are you doing here?" Margaret smirked, her eyes glinting with malice. "I came to finish what I started." Richard burst into the guest house moments later, flanked by security guards. He had noticed Margaret's absence from her penthouse and suspected she might try something drastic. "Margaret!" he roared, his voice echoing through the room. Margaret turned, her expression shifting from cold confidence to fury. "You ruined everything, Richard," she spat. "You and that girl." "It's over, Margaret," Richard said, his tone firm. "There's nowhere left for you to run." But Margaret didn't back down. Instead, she stepped closer to Lauren, her movements erratic. "She doesn't belong here," Margaret hissed. "She's taken everything from me." Before Margaret could do anything, the security guards moved in, restraining her. She struggled against them, screaming curses at Richard and Lauren as they dragged her away. In the aftermath, Lauren sat on the couch, her hands trembling. Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She can't hurt you anymore," he said softly. Lauren nodded, though the fear lingered. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Richard promised. "She'll face justice for everything she's done, As the night wore on, a sense of relief began to settle over the estate. Margaret's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The following morning, Margaret was in custody, her arrest making headlines across the country. The media, which had previously speculated on her innocence, turned sharply against her as the evidence Richard and Harris had collected became public. Margaret Adams arrested. The shocking truth behind a family betrayal. Adams' heiress kidnapping orchestrated by estranged ex-wife, evidence reveals. At the estate, the tension began to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. Lauren sat at the breakfast table with Richard and Ethan, the weight of the previous night still heavy but manageable. "She's finally where she belongs," Ethan said, sipping his coffee. "Behind bars." Lauren nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. "It's hard to believe it's really over, after everything she's done." Richard placed a hand on hers. "It's not over yet, but this is the beginning of the end. She'll face the consequences of her actions, and will finally be able to move on." At the courthouse, Harris and the legal team worked tirelessly to ensure Margaret's charges were airtight. With Michael Reed's testimony, the financial records, and the emails, the case against her was rock solid. "Margaret won't see the outside of a cell for a long time," Harris assured Richard during a meeting that afternoon. "That's all I want," Richard replied. "Justice for Emily, for Lauren, and for the family she tore apart." As the days passed, Lauren began to feel the weight of her new reality. She was no longer just Lauren Collins, the orphaned girl who had struggled to find her place in the world. She was Emily Adams, the long-lost daughter of a powerful family. One evening, she sat with Ethan in the garden, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. "Do you think things will ever feel normal?" she asked, her voice quiet. Ethan shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I don't think our family has ever been normal, but maybe that's not such a bad thing." Lauren smiled, finding comfort in his words. "I guess not." Meanwhile, Margaret's legal team scrambled to mount a defense. She remained defiant, refusing to admit guilt even as the evidence against her mounted. "I'll fight this," she told her lawyer during a heated meeting. "I'm not going to let Richard win." But even she couldn't ignore the growing tide of public opinion. With every new revelation, her reputation crumbled further. Back at the estate, life slowly began to stabilize. Lauren spent more time with Richard, learning about the family history and the business empire she had been born into. One afternoon, Richard showed her a photo album he had kept hidden for years. "This was Emily's," he said, handing it to her. Lauren opened the album, her breath catching as she saw pictures of herself as a child. Birthdays, holidays, simple moments of joy. "I don't remember any of this," she said. Her voice tinged with sadness. "That's okay," Richard said gently. "We'll make new memories. We'll build something better than what Margaret tried to destroy." Lauren nodded, her heart warming at the thought. On the day of Margaret's arraignment, Richard, Lauren, and Ethan watched the proceedings from the courthouse gallery. Margaret appeared stoic as the charges were read, but Lauren could see the cracks in her composure. When the judge denied bail, citing the overwhelming evidence and the risk of flight, Margaret's mask finally slipped. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of her crimes. As they left the courthouse, Lauren turned to Richard. "Do you think she regrets it?" Richard sighed, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know if Margaret is capable of regret, but what matters now is that she's being held accountable." That evening, the family gathered in the study, a sense of relief settling over them for the first time in weeks. "We did it," Ethan said, raising a glass. "We took her down." Lauren smiled, though her thoughts were still heavy. "It's strange. Finally knowing the truth. I spent so many years wondering who I was, and now I know, but it still feels incomplete." Richard placed an arm around her shoulders. "That's because healing takes time. We've been through a lot, but we have each other now, and that's what matters." Ethan nodded. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're rebuilding." For the first time, Lauren felt a sense of belonging, a feeling she had spent her entire life searching for as the night wore on. The family sat together, sharing stories and laughter. The shadows of the past no longer loomed as heavily, replaced by the light of a future they were determined to build together. Margaret's influence was finally gone, and with her out of their lives, the Adams family could finally begin to heal. But deep down, Lauren knew this was just the start of a new chapter, one where she could truly embrace her identity in the family she had found. Weeks passed, and the dust finally began to settle. Margaret's trial loomed on the horizon. But for the Addams family, the focus shifted from their painful past to the promise of a brighter future. Lauren found herself settling into her role as Emily Addams. It was strange at first, navigating the world of wealth, legacy, and the family she had only recently discovered. But with each passing day, she felt more at home, more like she truly belonged. One crisp autumn morning, Lauren walked through the estate gardens, the vibrant colors of the season surrounding her. She had started using the early hours to clear her mind, to reflect on the life she was building. Richard joined her, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," he remarked with a gentle smile. Lauren shrugged, smiling back. "It helps me think. A lot's changed in such a short time." Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change isn't always easy, but you've handled it with more grace than I could have imagined." Lauren glanced at him, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." Richard's smile widened, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I'm just glad you're here, Emily." Lauren paused, the name still unfamiliar yet comforting. "It feels strange sometimes. Being Emily, I was Lauren for so long." "You'll always be both," Richard said. "But the name doesn't define you, who you are. The kindness, the strength, that's what matters." Inside the estate, Ethan sat in the study, poring over business reports. Since Margaret's arrest, he had taken a more active role in the family company, determined to prove himself. Lauren joined him, peeking over his shoulder. "Still working," Ethan smirked. "Some of us have to keep this empire running." Lauren rolled her eyes playfully. "I'm trying to catch up, you know. You could help me instead of hogging all the knowledge." Ethan laughed, his tone light. "Fine, sit down, and I'll show you the ropes. But don't say I didn't warn you. This stuff can be mind-numbing." As they worked together, the sibling bond between them grew stronger. They shared jokes, stories, and plans for the future, the scars of Margaret's betrayal slowly fading. That evening, the family gathered for dinner, a rare moment of peace after weeks of chaos. The table was filled with laughter and conversation, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined their lives. "To new beginnings," Richard said, raising his glass. "To family," Ethan added. Lauren smiled, lifting her own glass. "To finally knowing where I belong." They clinked glasses, the warmth of the moment enveloping them. After dinner, Richard pulled Lauren aside. "There's something I want to show you," he said. Leading her to the study, he opened a drawer and retrieved a small wooden box, placing it gently on the desk. "This belonged to your mother," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. Lauren opened the box to find a delicate necklace with a locket. Inside was a tiny photo of a younger Richard, with a woman Lauren immediately recognized as her mother. "She gave this to me the day you were born," Richard explained. "I've kept it all these years, hoping I'd have the chance to give it to you." Lauren's eyes filled with tears as she carefully held the necklace. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "She would be so proud of you." "Emily?" Lauren nodded, her heart full. "I hope so." The next day, the Addams family stood together at a press conference. Richard announced a new philanthropic initiative in Emily's name, dedicated to supporting orphans and children in need. Lauren spoke to the crowd, her voice steady and confident. "For years, I didn't know where I came from or where I belonged, but I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, support, and the people who stand by you no matter what." Her words resonated with the audience, the story of her resilience and the family's redemption inspiring many. As the months passed, the Addams family flourished. Richard continued to lead the company with wisdom and strength, while Ethan and Lauren worked together to carve out their own paths. Lauren decided to honor her past by opening a foundation to help children find families and support. The work gave her a sense of purpose and healing, allowing her to turn her pain into something meaningful. One evening, as the family gathered by the fireplace, Richard looked around the room, his heart full. "We've been through so much," he said, his voice warm. "But sitting here, with both of you, I know we've come out stronger." Lauren and Ethan nodded, their smiles reflecting the bond they had forged. "Here's to what's ahead," Lauren said, lifting her mug of tea. "To the future," Ethan agreed. And as they sat together, the past finally felt like a closed chapter, replaced by the promise of a brighter, stronger tomorrow.